It is the international break, and while I could be using this time a little bit better to go on some different tangents about finances and potential future transfers, anything like that, we still have to kind of ruminate over the two losses that happened prior to the international break and really break down what is actually wrong or what could be wrong and the different levels of issues that the club might be having. So that is what we're focusing on today and talking some tactical issues with the first team. So welcome to episode 733 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Eye Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and I did say the word tactics, so like the bat signal in the old, probably my favorite cartoon ever, Batman the Animated Series from the early 90s. The bat signal has gone out, and that means that the Purist has answered the call. So as always, the Purist, biggest welcome back to the show. Thanks so much again for everybody tuning in to both his channel and my channel. Please subscribe on YouTube to help us both out there, but help me give a warm welcome back to the Purist.
Thank you very much, Dan. Always good to be back.
Well, I have enjoyed some of the content that you've been making recently. A few weeks ago, you had something on Pep Guardiola and his pragmatism and ability to change. And you also had a video, which I would say is almost required viewing for the conversation we're about to have, and that was about the synergy between Pedri and Jong. So that is going to be down in the show notes or in the description below if you're either listening or you're watching this on YouTube. So I'm not going to say get away from this video or podcast and come back, but yeah, that is definitely some required viewing beforehand, as well as, again, joining both the Purist and I on Patreon for me, as low as $3 just to get these shows for free. Okay, so we did that. Now it's time for all that really fun tactics talk, where I think where we start with kind of diagnosing what the issue is. Well, let's recap first the two games. It was Barcelona. They were beaten 2-1 to PSG and then 4-1 to Sevilla. And as I said, it is always hard to understand where to begin. I think we should probably start with the press, which does connect pretty quickly to the high line, which is all that everybody and pundits seem to be focusing on, that the issue is the high line. But I'm going to ask you actually off the top, before we get into any of the nuance here, after two losses for the first time in 2025, is there a bit of an overreaction right now with all of this tactic talk and Hansi Flick, needing to change things up radically or to make adaptations for a team that seems to be, we'll say, figured out by oppositions in year two for Flick?
I would say that there probably is a slight overreaction. I think in general terms, you can point to non-tactical reasons why the team suffered a little bit more in those two games. For example, the overload of matches and fatigue. So there are extenuating circumstances to an extent. However, clearly teams have a better idea how to deal with this team than they once did. And as a result, there are going to have to be some conversations. However, it's not all bad. It's not all crumbling and falling into the ground as quickly as some people might like to think. This is still a very, very good team, arguably certainly one of the best in the world. And yeah, it has some deficiencies, especially that have been exploited by injuries as well, which also have added to those extenuating circumstances. So all in all, there are things to talk about, but it's not as dreadful and the end of the world as many people like to think.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. And the way that we're going to have this conversation, I think while tactically PSG and Sevilla did similar things to Barcelona, I think there was, to me, my takeaway was that those matches can exist on their own. To me, the biggest issue for PSG was that due to the injuries, and yes, I know PSG had their injuries as well, and this is why I did actually write, and I said that Luis Enrique did kind of outmaneuver and outmanage Hansi Flick in that second half. I did feel like, just despite fatigue, that the subs for PSG had a better understanding of how to keep up the intensity of that match than Barcelona subs did. And Barcelona subs did kind of change the match, and not necessarily for the better in that game against PSG, where against Sevilla, things were a bit different that we're going to talk about. And for Barcelona, I think Sevilla, I came away with very few positives at all. But that first half against PSG, I was largely positive. The way that Barcelona pressed PSG in the first at least 30 minutes was very much mirroring one another. The way that Barcelona pressed Vitinha got him all out of sorts. They were man marking him, and the way they pressed him, he gave the ball away in the 19th minute, and that's how Barcelona scored their first goal. The issue with Barca was that they could not sustain that press into the second half, which I think is a big reason why they failed to get a positive result against PSG. And then again, you take that and you have a match a few days later against Sevilla, and you wonder why Barcelona's press also didn't look itself. Now, talking about the tactics against PSG in more detail here, both teams were playing a zonal marking scheme that transitioned quickly into man marking with the back pass to the keeper, which is something that we see a lot. Again, it's the ideas of Pep Guardiola that have now been tweaked and spread around world football and have been taken almost to their extremes. And not to make excuses too, but without Fermin Lopez and Rafinha, who in terms of distance traveled are like top 5 in Europe, even though that they've or top 10 in Europe, even though they've played 2 less matches than everybody else, which is still pretty insane. And I think the other positive for me is that PSG still didn't break through that high line for the second time in that game until the 90th minute. But in terms of that zonal marking scheme that PSG had and then switching to the man mark, it certainly did work really well against Barcelona and pressing Barca. And then against Sevilla with Matias Almeida, as he said, teams who aren't afraid of Barca are doing better this season than the teams that just sit back against them. And the teams that sit back just make it a numbers game, and Barcelona have enough good chances as an attacking unit. They are number one in big chances created again in Europe for the second straight year, that you can, if you go at them, that does take them a little bit out of their game. But in terms of the pressing functions for Barcelona, both to deal with the press and then pressing themselves, I did see a little bit of weakness across 2 games for sure. And I'm not going to ask you which of the 2 kind of worries you the most, but what were the frailties you saw in Barcelona, both being pressed and pressing?
Yeah, so I suppose the bigger issue is the being pressed situation, at least for these 2 games, because like I said, the fatigue element does add to the lack of, um, let's say, intensity in your own press, sorry. And I think generally speaking, the fully fit and, um, fully, rested version of Barcelona is still a very decent pressing machine. Uh, Flick, like you said, does operate with the zonal two-man system, which generally speaking works. It can get a little bit, in fact, I would say it gets more exposed the more tired your players are, because you're not just sticking to a man, you have to wait in a zone, and then when a pass happens, when a trigger happens, you're having to cover a lot of ground. So having just Pedri and De Jong trying to track opposition midfielders and not having the likes of Femení and Rafinha ahead of them does make it a very difficult thing to accomplish. I think when the team is at its best, that's not a huge issue. It can sometimes be exposed with balls into the floor, especially when the wingers press the opposition centre back, leaving a gap for the opposition fullbacks because Barca's own fullbacks have hit. That sometimes creates a little bit of an issue and escape for teams. Against Bayern last year, that was a problem. But generally speaking, it's a defensive setup that has done a decent job to prevent, or at least in comparison to the amount of chances that Barca themselves create, it does limit teams from playing the way that they want to play. So the bigger issue is the inability to play out of the man-to-man press, specifically the one that we saw in the second half versus PSG, and then an even more aggressive version against Sevilla. I will say though that I did go back and watch that game against Bayern last year. Quite useful reference, because Bayern also tried to apply a similar man-to-man setup. So yeah, Rafinha and Firmino, very useful outlets to the press, and Lewandowski also winning more of his own duels, which makes Barca a lot better at playing through that. Because generally speaking, and this is the worst part about playing such an aggressive press, is that it kind of shuts your midfield out of the game, at least in build-up. De Jong and Pedri kind of shut out completely. And you are relying on your forwards to be very, well, they are essentially your way out of that press. So Lewandowski losing duels against both PSG and Sevilla. No Rafinha and Femení to exploit the space in behind. Olmo being kind of a passenger in both of those games and not being that player to be on the end of those line-breaking passes from the defense. It was kind of a perfect storm in Barca becoming weaker at dealing with that situation.
Yeah, I want we'll get to the high line in a second, but I think that perfectly leads us in talking a little bit about Pedri and De Jong, which for me I think is definitely glass half full here. As I said, I would go back and say it's essential viewing to watch your video on YouTube about their synergy and this new version, because I think after PSG, everything for me changed in terms of how Barcelona dealt with that PSG press in the 32nd minute. Once De Jong picks up that yellow in transition, that kind of changed everything. And we all saw in the second half, Pedri, who was constantly kicked throughout that match, just death by 1,000 little kicks. And that has kind of been how you deal with Pedri. And I put quotes on that because that was also one of the strategies on how you deal with Messi, especially in his latter years in La Liga, is that you just kick him and try to unbalance him just a little bit by, again, all this stuff that is enough physicality not to be called a foul, because if you did that, then the ref would constantly just be blowing his whistle and stopping play, and a ref isn't going to do that. So you push that to the very limit on how to deal with that. And of course, Luis Enrique knows how to deal with a player like Messi or a player like Pedri, who is the metronome, not even a metronome, but who is the pace setter, we'll say. I mean, Messi even did that in his latter years. And then for Sevilla, my concern was, to that point, an over-reliance on Pedri and De Jong out of that press to build up. And what that means is that you said Olmo going missing, is that very little from Rashford and Ferran Torres being able to come inside and create a numerical overload. That just wasn't happening. Lewandowski came back a few times to support and would drop in, but his first touch wasn't good enough against Sevilla to create anything. Barcelona also were not really doing well to win the second balls, which again kind of negates and limits the amount that you could go far. And I'd also mentioned on the match review that I did in the 5 headlines that you saw the drop off between Tech's long balls and ability to play out of the back to Lewandowski's. I mean, not Lewandowski, to Juan Garcia. Lewandowski in net, that'd be something. But to have those long balls from Juan Garcia is just a bit of a drop off from Tech. So now you're also losing some of the accuracy on the balls that might have bailed you out from the back, from the keeper. Because as we know, as I said, like it turns into a man marking situation a lot of the times from a zonal marking scheme once that ball goes back to the keeper. That is usually the permutation for a lot of different teams. And then also having, no disrespect to Araujo, but an inability in that first half, at least until Eric Garcia came on in the second, an inability from your entire right side between Araujo and Koundé to largely break through with their passes that first line of pressure. So everything I just said puts so much of an over-reliance on Pedri and De Jong. To me, that was the big concern. And we've talked a lot about Pedri de Bencia, and you just, I mean, I've said it before, the way that the matches seem to lose control and lose their pausa. But I actually kind of started to push back on that because I did rewatch the second half of PSG, and somebody in my comments had mentioned to me, hey, I don't think that when Pedri left against PSG, I don't think that Barcelona lost that much control. I think they were losing control beforehand and afterwards. And again, glass half full. I'll let you talk about the negative parts of all of that and the potential over-reliance on Pedri and De Jong. But to me, this is the best version of De Jong we're seeing. And you kind of mentioned that in your video as well. And I honestly believe that. And the stats also back that up for the first time ever. I think that I, through the years, did not think that De Jong was capable of, we'll say, learning the pausa. I remember a game against Napoli or a few years ago, and then there was one against Villarreal a few years ago as well. And those individual matches I look to because I remember writing in my notes, like, this is the most pausa I've ever seen De Jong have. It was the only time in De Jong's whole career I really felt like he was dictating play, and he would release the ball at the right time, receive it at the right time, know exactly how many touches to take. And that was never really the case with De Jong. I always felt he was either taking too many touches or was always caught between two minds of I could dribble the ball here or maybe I can just pass it off. And I always felt like everything was so we'll say formulaic or very structured with De Jong. And as I said, to the point that you make in the video, he seems free for the very first time, and not free where other players on his team are sacrificing, but he seems to fit in this structure that Hansi Flick has set out, and he has freedom within it. His 94% passing is some of the best he's had in his entire career. Only two players in Spain rank higher with 94% passing, and he ranks eighth in passes into the final third, which just tell you that he's not only involved in buildup by dropping between the center backs, but he's also being involved in Barcelona's final third in their final product. And so to me, I know it is very negative, all I'm saying about Barcelona's inability to work if Pedri and De Jong are being man marked the way they are, but it's also for good reason because De Jong is having his best season ever. Again, the stats seem to back that up.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like I said in that video, I see that partnership as one of the best in the world right now. And I think a lot of the things that you're saying about De Jong have improved thanks to having a player like Pedri beside him, and then having that partnership becoming kind of the engine of the team, rather than trying to fit De Jong into what your version of a pivot looks like, or playing a specific role for a specific system. The manner in which those two manage the game on the ball has become the cornerstone of the way that Barcelona play football. And that is, as you said, as you rightly said, the reason why if you take them out of the game, it looks like a completely different team. Now, the reality is that you can't rely on two players to dominate every game if the opponent is going to go to such lengths in order to cut them out. So, in the second half against PSG in Sevilla, it wasn't a zonal to man system. It was a pure man to man marking system. They were just stood on them at all times. So much so that if the defender, whether it was Eric Garcia or whoever, could literally just waltz into midfield and nobody would press them. Nobody would try and stop them because the opposition midfield just passed it because they were marking De Jong and Pedri. Now, that creates a situation where you are reliant on other pieces of your team to solve problems. And the best version of that for this team is what we saw at times last season with a more direct approach through the likes of Rafinha and Femení, and Balde as well. Incredibly important to that because if you don't have reliable fullbacks and your opponent's trigger is to wait until the ball goes to the fullback and then press, well then you're not going to get anywhere because they're just going to be stuck on the ball and unable to find solutions. And Balde is so good at finding those solutions, just stepping past the player, accelerating past the player, and breaking a press, by himself essentially. So without him, with Koundé looking a little bit shaky, with Varane and Olmo not really being that great in the duels that they're involved in, then yeah, you do create a situation where without the controlled possession of De Jong and Pedri, then Barcelona can't really get anything going. And I do want to say that I do believe that is partly a temporary problem. However, there are probably some solutions that you could look into to make the unit as a whole less susceptible to that press. So whether it be, inverting fullbacks. I remember one situation in, I think it was a Sevilla game, where De Jong was getting pressed and he kind of dragged the player out of the middle, and there was space to go into for Koundé, and he didn't go in. He just stayed on the touchline. And so there are some tactical things that you can do to ensure that that you are better exploiting the overcommitment of that man-to-man press. But yeah, like I've been saying, all of these situations get much better with Barcelona's more suited profiles on the pitch.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation of the fact that personnel wise is really essential to the way that Hansi Flick does play. But I, yeah, I think then trying to transition that into the high line, which again, Skippy, as listeners and viewers will hear in the background, is very much like the pundits. The high line is the thing that really gets them upset. The high line is the thing that it seems like pundits are always bringing up. So I'll ask you. I have some of my own ideas, but I'll ask you kind of to. I know it's again an oversimplification, but to you, do you find that Hansi Flick in year two now that teams know how high line, how he's going to play that high line, do you find that, that he needs to be reconsidering just how high that line is and what's going into that?
I think that question itself is kind of, it's a bit reductive to the nuance of that tactic because,
Yeah,
you know,
I do apologize. I know it is, and that's why again I asked it to you in a, I guess not say snarky way, but because again when you're on television and you're doing Champions League coverage, and again I love Thierry Henry, but when you get 20 seconds, you have to blame something on something, right? And then
right.
the high line is that buzzword, right? And so that's why I just want to make clear that I'm asking it in that reductive way, and I'm looking forward to how you navigate it.
Yeah, I totally understand. I think, the nuance of it is that, um, well, generally speaking, the high line allows Barcelona to accomplish two things. One is that they don't have to defend almost ever in a block, which helps a lot when you have players like De Jong and Pedri in the middle of that block. Then you're not exposed. You don't have two huge natural defensive midfielders who are sensing danger and dealing with players moving around them. You don't have to worry about any of that because you can just target players man to man. And it also means that opposition teams don't get the opportunity to play their preferred way, their preferred style, and you force them to attack quickly, which not every team wants to do, especially a lot of the bigger teams. When you force them to do that, actually, then you take away what makes them so good. Similarly to when you press Barcelona, and you take away the quality of De Jong and Pedri. Obviously, the bigger question around it is the context. So I think the issue that a lot of people have, and that I can definitely sympathize with, is why are you playing that all the way until the 100th minute when the game is really tight, and that one small that small margin of error that you're playing with can cost you your life in a competition. That's not worth it, as opposed to if you're doing it minute 20 in a La Liga game, for example. um, so there is that. I think there is probably an adjustment to be made with regards to the context of it. um, However, I do think some of the problems are overstated because it looks like the High Line is getting exploited when actually it isn't. And I'll explain. Against Sevilla, for example, a lot of the times that you saw Sevilla getting in behind that quote unquote high line was actually just because Barcelona's own possession had broken down in really bad areas. So, particularly in the fullback areas, like I said, Koundé getting exposed, and players trying to let's say disrupt that man-to-man press, moving around all over the place, and then the possession breaks down. Well, then you it's very easy to expose you. There's no, it's not like you're pressing and the press is getting exploited and then your high line gets exploited. No, a lot of the time it's that it's your own possession breaking down, leading to those chances, and a lot of that can be cut out. A lot of that can be dealt with. um, so I do think on a couple of fronts there, it's like I said, it's not so simple just to blame the high line. It gives Barcelona a lot, but yeah, context can be tweaked, and you know you have to realize that your possession is linked to your out of possession, as we all know. So you have to get both things right to look like a good football team.
Yeah, I would also say when you mentioned where and how in which Barcelona are losing the ball to have their high line attacked, not having Lamine Yamal against Sevilla, that changes everything because
Yeah,
when I've criticized him, it's because he loses the ball closer to midfield, right? That was my big problem with Dembele for so many years, is that when he would lose the ball, it would be in a position that made Barcelona easy to be attacked going the other way. And at the time, again, they did not have the speed through the middle to deal with an immediate turnover at midfield. Because again, then a team only had to really get that ramp up of speed for one half of a field, as opposed to in their own final third, where Barcelona would then have the time in transition to get themselves positioned the way that they needed to stop that counterattack. And so without Lamine Yamal, who, as I said, who's generally, and I say this very generally, but when he is on his game, that pushes that line of confrontation for the opposition back, even though they don't want to, like Sevilla said, or that Matias Almeida said for Sevilla, while they did attack Barcelona and they wanted to be on the front foot on their press, great. But he also would admit that with Lamine Yamal on the field, they just can't do that because they themselves defensively are unbalanced because you always have to have. We saw this in the first half against PSG until it looked like the fitness for Lamine Yamal did slow in that second half. Where, yes, defensively, sure, Lamine Yamal was also a little weaker, but offensively, even as Lamine Yamal did not look as fit as he normally did, that meant that PSG defense did not have to shade over to their left side as much as they would have, or they were in the first half with Lamine Yamal looking like he was completely up to it, as we know. Like he was in the first 15 minutes completely unplayable for PSG. And if he's going to continue to attract that attention, that means that it's a lot difficult. It's more difficult to, even if he turns the ball over deep in PSG's final third, again, they're also all overloaded numerically on their left side. And now they're looking to transition with a long ball. And it's a lot easier to win that second ball for Barcelona when it's a 40-yard diagonal that they're anticipating, because again, it's a numerical overload on one side. The other thing I would say too is people feel like Rayo had broken down the way to break down Barcelona's high press is by keeping a player offside, and then it's either a second man running through the middle on the offside trap, so not the first man who is offside, he stays out of the play until he can get behind the ball, or as PSG did it, they were attacking through Hakimi on the wing, like we knew they were going to do. We knew that the second man run, if you want to call it that, was to keep again your one player offside, and then it would be Hakimi from a deeper position to be the man who would time that run to try to break the offside press. And then Sevilla were doing it through the middle. They were keeping Isaac usually in an offside position, and then either they'd bring him back, throw somebody else up there, and then they look to break through the middle. And to your point, by and large, though, Barcelona keeps or has their opposition jumping offside more than any other team in Europe, and this is by design. And I think this kind of reminds me of like the Golden State Warriors in the mid 2010s, because everybody up to that point had said, well, you cannot win by shooting a ton of threes. And the point was, well, if you're doing it at a higher level and you're doing it at a level of excellence that is getting the results you need, well, then it's going to work, right? And it did work because of Steph Curry, and the numbers game did kind of bear fruit to it. And I kind of feel the same way about Hansi Flick, and we'll say this high line and the offside trap. More saying it the offside trap than calling it a high line, because if your offside trap is the best in Europe, right? And you're creating so many chances by playing this risk reward system, by having your line of convertation so high that you're just continuing to, it's a numbers game in terms of chances on the other side. I look back at both the PSG and the Sevilla game and I go, well, if Dani Olmo hadn't missed those chances, if Ferran Torres hadn't missed that chance, if Lewandowski hasn't missed that PK, if Lamine Yamal is actually even on the field, if Rafinha is actually even on the field, right? And there's so many what ifs for those two matches. I say, well, actually results are probably positive, and all of the issues with that press, they could still exist. And it's not about outscoring your opponent. It's, again, about winning those different game states and where that line of conversation is over the course of 90 minutes. And to that point, when you're missing so much personnel and you don't taking your chances, that is the recipe really to losing, more than it is, blaming this high line.
I agree. I will say though that I think generally speaking, it's positive to ensure that your your tactics or just your general gameplay as a football team is adaptable. Because as soon as it becomes rigid and set to a certain way of doing things because you think that's what works, or we've had success like that with that in the past, as soon as you get into that rigid mindset, then you become exploitable because you become predictable. And like you were saying about the, standing offside and then the second man and all of that, yes, teams are going to be better at doing that now because they've had time to study Barcelona. And that's why context and being adaptable to context is important, so that you're not caught being predictable. That goes for your football in possession and out of possession as well. That's why I've been very critical, over recent times of managers that are too rigid in their tactics, because they become too predictable for the opposition, and you don't give the players the room and the understanding of how to adapt in a specific game state. And that's the most important thing of all, particularly in knockout competitions where one moment kills you. So I do think that, an evolution needs to happen with regards to that high line. But in the context of these two games and the broader season, it isn't the disastrous, it isn't the thing that has been solved by opposition teams that is going to now render Barcelona, useless as a competitive team. I disagree with that, but some adaptation is certainly needed. Just like with any successful version of anything, you have to keep adapting it, otherwise people are going to figure it out.
Well, I will say I did enjoy, and I think that just from my perspective, I think the happiest I ever heard you in a voiceover to do videos was whenever you were talking about the Fluminense team from what was that, last season, right? I just, the joy that you had as you were, because that is an example of a team that maybe was having a little too much freedom, and once teams figured out how to kind of break down some of that freedom, yeah, they didn't necessarily get their desired results. Because again, over 90 minutes, if you're that free, then that means that things aren't working. And I always say that for the high line, the success of that high line comes in the communication. And as I said, like Tech might be more experienced, but Tech had a lack of a less of a control over his box than Juan Garcia does, just because of his physicality and athleticism. And that lack of control in the box for Tech does kind of hurt your high line in front of you. Because again, that just means that that line of conversation that Barcelona have been set, there's all that space in the middle that you can't trust your goalkeeper is going to make up that space for. So I said, I also don't want to forget, and I keep kind of trying to mention without that your goalkeeper and Juan Garcia is just as important of a loss as the other ones. And again, it's not disrespecting Tech as a like for like replacement, but he just doesn't command his box the way that Juan Garcia does. And that stuff is really important, not just on set pieces, but in terms of coming off your line and cutting down those angles and cutting down that space. Because I think, to me, as I said, in both breaking that press with Araujo and Kunde and Tech, I found there were issues as well, especially against Sevilla, with then defending in that high line between Araujo and not necessarily Kunde, but Araujo and Tech. Because again, Tech's lack of command in his box was kind of denying Araujo the opportunity to use his physicality to cut down those angles in a better way. But it's a larger issue with Araujo. And I think the numbers do bear out that Araujo is continuing in year two. Now, I was very optimistic about having a full preseason. You know, he missed the first half of last season with Hansi Flick. And so as that team last year, the same time last year when they were struggling to get results, and they kind of all as a unit figured things out, Araujo wasn't part of that figuring all that out. And so he came into the team in the second half of last season not being the number one option and having to kind of figure all those things out on the fly as everyone else had kind of refined things. But now with the offseason, I was optimistic, and yet there is still a high number of fouls per 90 for Araujo. And for the first time in his career, he's committing 2 fouls per match, which again is his worst in his entire career. He is the 4th center back in all of Europe with the most fouls, and that's 2.10 per match. And this fouling from Araujo, to me, it seems unfortunate, like an indication that it's all not working for him just yet in that high line for Hansi Flick. It's all just not, and I'm not sure what that is. And I'd love to hear your Araujo thoughts.
Yeah, Araujo's always a difficult one to talk about because I feel like he's a more complicated footballer than would appear. Um, you know, it does surprise me, that statistic about fouls, because under Xavi, when he was probably first choice quite comfortably, that system was probably more reliant on fouling because you had the high line, but you didn't have the offside trap. With the offside trap, you don't have to engage as much. Um, so that does surprise me, but I suppose it does point to the fact that yes, communication wise, he is not in tune with the rest of the back line with regards to the high line as you would with the other centre backs that are available, and certainly not compared to last year's partnership of Martinez and Kubasi. So it is, unfortunately, at this stage, another weakness of Araujo that you have to take into consideration, and that's on top of the weakness that you already have with his ball playing in comparison to the rest of the centre backs. And if he's not doing either of those things particularly well, then it's hard to justify seeing him in a first 11 at the moment. I think, surprisingly to a lot of people, you'd put Eric Garcia above him in the pecking order at this stage, and that's kind of indicative of how it's going for Araujo. I don't want to write him off, certainly not, because the kind of raw ingredients as a centre back are clearly there. And, you look at many of the teams playing these aggressive defensive strategies in Europe, and they all have these very athletic, very aggressive centre backs, and that's useful. But you have to be able to do the fundamentals right, and you have to be able to, yeah, be aligned with the rest of your back line. That's just as important as what you do individually, much more so as a centre back. So that all sounds quite negative, and I think the reality just is that for me right now, he'd be my, what, third choice, in terms of, as a partner to Kabasi.
Yeah, and friend of the show, Kevin Williams, is a staunch defender of Araujo, and I think that's fair. I think the hate for Araujo is a bit overdone. So I want to be very clear with that. And I think our criticism of Araujo at this point in our show is kind of indicative of when I go through the issues that Barcelona has, this is where he is on the pecking order in terms of even the issues that I still think defensively, all the good that he does, all the fires that he puts out, when you're playing that high line, I don't want to make. I want to make sure that we're not underrating those fires that he puts out and the way in which he affects the game with his physicality. Because again, when I look at Sevilla, yes, that defense did give away 4 goals, but other than him giving away the PK, which I do still think was a PK, other than him giving away the PK, very little blame actually to me falls on Araujo in those four goals. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but Kubarsi kind of made that point in postgame, and whether or not you think that a teenager should be criticizing the rest of his teammates like this is another story for another time. But Kubarsi did kind of mention that, if we're not pressing from our front line, it just leaves us exposed. And I think that was kind of the issue with Sevilla that I spoke about. Like when I look at Barcelona's inability to keep possession and to break through that press from Sevilla in a coordinated, good way, that just meant, again, more opportunities for Sevilla to come and attack Araujo and Kubarsi in space. And I think any center back is going to, if you leave them on an island and make them defend space over and over and over and over and over again for 90 minutes, they are going to commit fouls and make mistakes. And I think that's, again, the nature of what we saw against Sevilla. Now, last little conversation point here about the first team, for the men, I should say. There's been some conversation that will be over the next week and a half of the international break about, number nines. And it's funny to me watching Kool-Aids even disagree on what that profile could be. We've heard Guirassy, Julian Alvarez, of course, Haaland gets mentioned. And then there's others who say that, hey, on the other side of things, if you're going to spend money, it's got to be on a center back. And then you hear from internally, Deco and Hansi Flick, and they're saying, no, we have center backs. We don't need a center back. And yet you have a lot of Kool-Aid saying, well, it looks like you need a center back to me. So as far as those two profiles in particular, potentially next summer, let's say, again, this is pie in the sky. Let's say that the club does get back into the Camp Nou. I know it's crazy, but let's say they finally do get back there. And when I say get back there, not at 27,000 capacity or 45,000 capacity, because you might as well just be in Montjuic for that. But let's say they do get back to 60,000 capacity by like March, and they like make a little money, and maybe the revenue is up, and they can't afford either a number 9 or a center back or something like that. Do you think, looking at this squad and the issues, and I say issues again in quotes because, as we know, like they could go off and win 17 to 18 straight games after the international break, but at the worst case scenario of this squad, do you feel like either through number 9 or a center back, or even all over the field, like I'll open that up for you, do you think a certain profile is missing that could enhance this team under Hansi Flick if he had, this kind of player or that kind of player?
I would say that I think, in terms of priority, I would put fullback ahead of centre back. I think, like you alluded to at the end of the last point on, the centre backs getting exposed, I think a lot of those problems are down more to what's happening around them rather than the centre backs themselves. And I think the fullbacks are a big part of that. And I would like to see more competition for Koundé, certainly, and potentially a more reliable backup for Balde. I think that both of those things make you much more competitive against the elite teams that press you. But the other major addition that I think would transform this team is a more reliable let's say not hold up man, because I don't want to give the impression of some big lump who's just there to kick the ball to, but somebody in a forward area that is very, very reliable at helping the team escape pressure, essentially playing with their back to goal and helping the team escape pressure, but then also doing a little bit more in terms of, combination and kind of what Lewandowski was doing really in his first season or 2 seasons. I think Lewandowski came and impressed me massively in possession, and that ability to drop in and help out, I think helps a lot. And I have been watching quite a lot of Bayern recently, quite a lot of Bayern Munich, because I'm prepping a video on them, and it's very easy to say, oh, give me a guy like Harry Kane, because we're talking about one of the best forwards in the world, technically speaking. But what he gives to that team is actually what I think would be perfect for this Barcelona, in terms of he's a constant kind of escape for the team under pressure. He kind of just floats around, becomes a free man, and allows them to. He's so reliable. When the ball comes into his feet under pressure, he can just create some space and then find a man. It's that kind of pressure release that I would love to see, and it would help the team play more of the game that they want to play, because you don't want. At least I don't want to see this Barcelona team become some basketball team. Even in the big games, you want the team to be able to, yes, escape pressure, but then put that in, turn that into a possession, turn that into Jong and Pedri with the ball, and a guy up front that can win those duels and do that allows you to do that. It gives you that outlet. So for me, that would be it, like the dream. And I wouldn't be worrying so much about trying to get like an over the shoulder guy, or more of like a I don't know. I really like Julian Alvarez. He would probably be up there as well in terms of like players that I would look to sign just because of his quality. But I do think, that kind of presence against very aggressive centre backs is really useful.
Yeah, I really agree with that as well. And I was thinking as you were speaking about that, the ability to get out of trouble and that pressure, and I kind of want to bring that to a conversation, not a conversation, but just a little point on some of the youngsters in Barca's squad. I think you're also seeing a outspoken minority, and again, I also cover La Masia and do English speaking content on La Masia like few do, and yet I can say in the case of Dro and Jofre Torrens and Tony Fernandez, and then even adding Rooney Bardaji to this a little bit too, as we're kind of speaking, to get out of that pressure does take a bit of physicality. I think that's what we keep coming back to as well. Barcelona, they are the team with the most XG created in Europe's top 5 leagues this season. And when I look at the offensive tools of, again, Rooney and Dro and Tony Fernandez, you throw them into that, and they're part of that solution. I think they are depth pieces offensively when Barcelona have the ball. And I think, again, while Barcelona they control so much of possession, it's that extra element. And that's the thing that's missing from Dro Fernandez's game, because, again, he is 17 years old. And so that physical ability to win the ball back is really, really important. And it is that it's something I struggled with as a player for years, was that I was a small kid. So that from my waist up, I had to put the work in the gym in ways that other kids didn't, right? Genetics matter. And so some kids are just bigger. And so I had to, when I was in high school, I had to hit the gym, and I had to put more, as much as I could. Obviously, I'm still very, I'm not this gigantic hulking creature, but from, my waist up, I had to put the work in, just because it wasn't genetically, it wasn't natural. And Dro is very much a similar way. Like, the kid is an absolute genius when the ball is on the ground, when the ball at his feet. It's really, you see that special thing about him. And Tony, to a point too, when he is running at an opponent, there was something very special about Tony. And when Rooney was 15 years old and he's debuting for Copenhagen and getting a spot when he was 16 for Copenhagen, it was a similar thing. Downhill, my goodness, on the ball, like, Rooney Bardaji was one of those very, very, very mercurial special prodigies. And yes, he's had an ACL injury. He's still coming back from that. So I ask people to be patient. But it is that physical part of that game, that the level of competition that Barcelona are facing, they are facing everybody's best shot. And Lamine Yamal, it's almost a testament to just how special he and Pedri and Lamine and again Lamine were to prepare for the physicality that comes with first team football from the age of 15 and 16. Because Pedri was just ready. I mean, his ability to shield opponents off the ball at 16 was really special. Gavi's physicality and intensity for a 16-year-old when he came up was just insane. Like it is a level of mentality that people cannot understand. And then Lamine Yamal is just so, and I will use the word here and own it, the way he is generational on the ball, right? Generational on the ball is something you cannot expect of these other very, very incredible 17-year-old, 18, 19-year-old kids.
Yeah, and it's really a blessing as always for players like that to come through, and you not have to worry about it. But yeah, you're right. It is clearly these guys are freaks in the best way possible when they come in and do that. Particularly Lamine. I was impressed by Rooney Badaji against Sevilla. Just a quick note on him. I know obviously he caught a lot of flack at the end because he should have scored and should have passed and cost a couple of attacks, but he was really bright. And I was slightly worried that in the game beforehand, I can't remember who it was against when Lamine came on and got an assist immediately. In the first half of that game, Rooney was a little bit it felt like he was a little bit pocketed by the
that was the Real Sociedad game where both he and Dro together, I think to that point, were kind of, they struggled a bit with Real Sociedad's physicality, I think, together, and they were unable to, build those same things on that right side for Barca, which is always a point of strength with Lamine.
Yeah, exactly. So the performance against Sevilla, in contrast to that, I actually thought was really good. But it is a team that could do with a little bit more in terms of just established presence, I think. And that's why a player like Kane. In fact, I'm gonna be the guy that sort of spearheads the push for that, because apparently his contract is out at the end of the year or something. So yeah, somebody like that I think would just be a really nice addition in the way that Lewandowski was when he first came in.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how Barcelona do kind of solve that. Like Deco's saying, oh, but Ferran Torres can do that, but we know like functionally he can't. Like structurally over the course of a full season, that's not going to happen. You cannot do that. You can't, and this is my final transition. There are just a little quick talking point. Speaking of Barcelona and Bayern Munich, unlike the way that Pere Romeu deals with the Barca Femení team, where the Barca Femení team talent there allows you to play different ways, and yet they do play a 4-3-3. And the way that they use their fullbacks, when you speak about like fullbacks who can solve problems, to me, when I watched Barcelona against Bayern Munich in that 7-1 win in the Champions League the other day for the Femení, that really was a difference. That the fullbacks for Barcelona are so good at breaking through any pressure. They're so good at whether on the dribble or with a pass, they're able to get out of trouble in every part of the field. And then, of course, when you're combining that with the superior midfield talent you have, and again, comparing that again with Pajor, who is going to finish chances again. You have a number 9 that's going to finish chances. When Barca Femení look dominant, they truly look dominant. Again, whether it's the men's version of the game or the women's version of the game, it doesn't matter because all the principles are very much the same. With that, the third woman runs or the runs in from late, or again, just combining with sheer technical superiority. Some of those passes are breaking through lines, are breaking through pressure, that it doesn't matter if you press them or not. They're press resistant. And that is when Barca Femení at its best looks completely inevitable. And I'm not sure, but again, I've always said with the women's game to the men's game, not to try to compare the two, but when a women's team is dominant, those score lines can get pretty hairy pretty quickly, because a dominant team, once they've broken through, there's just a different level of again, intensity and dominance when there seems to be a larger gap. Where yes, it happens, right? Like you look at Germany and Brazil, and that's 7-1, and but those are farther and fewer in between. Where when this Barca Femení team starts to score, that's why you do see, especially in League F, you see more 9-1s or 8-1s or 6-0s or 7-1s, whatever it is. That gap is a bit wider in the women's game for a myriad of reasons. But I think what's most shocking, and the reason why I bring this result up right now, is because it was a shocking result against a Bayern Munich team, because I think with the Barca Femení, it's really tough when it comes to PR and how we receive them. It's a lose-lose situation because if they lose, obviously Liga F or the Spanish Primera Division isn't challenging enough, and that means that Barcelona is overrated when they're playing outside of Spain. But then when they win, because of the way that, again, they show their utter dominance, that just winds up being the expectation, and then they should win every game. They should win every trophy. They should be all conquering, and we just don't hold the men's teams to that same standard, right? Regardless of who won the Champions League, it could not be the best team in Europe that year. And I think last season, Arsenal beating Barcelona Femení were not that was not the best team in Europe holding that trophy at the end of it. I come away from that Bayern Munich game with the confirmation bias that is that this Barcelona Femení team, just in the way that they play football and the football that they play, and then the individual talents that they have, and the way that they have players like Claudia Pina who can't seem to get in the 11 of starting big matches, or in Vicky Lopez as well, just continuing to need to break out, need to get those minutes to continue to be the player that we know she is. Still, she wins the Copa Trophy, not being a regular starter. And that team, that being the Femení team, is 14 to 15 players deeper than any other team in Europe still, even though they didn't have the financial backing of the board. And, almost a credit to the Femení that despite not being reinforced with experienced talent, they still have the system and the talent, and not only the individual success, but it really is a team unit that is overpowering. And I always implore people, it's not just about watching Aitana or Alexia. It's actually about the unit and the team. And then you see against Bayern Munich, when all of it's coming to fruition with that 14 deep that they have, it's just incredible.
Yeah, I feel like I say it on every single podcast that I have ever featured in, and that's that football is like way simpler than than really we spend a lot of time talking about tactics and all the rest of it. But if you have better players and a better unit and better synergies, then you win games. And I think the game, to be honest, is with, like you said at the end there, the inability for, or the increase in difficulty to just spend for a lot of teams with competition from, very money back to leagues and state-owned clubs and all the rest of it. The emphasis is going to be on production of players, and that's one thing that Barcelona as an institution have always had and will continue to have, and is one of the biggest performance competitive benefits that the club will continue to retain for hopefully as the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think our keyword today, this is like Sesame Street for those in the US. The word of the day was synergy. And so the Purists, I really appreciate. I feel like maybe this is like Pedri and Jong last season, where Pedri, you knew he was the guy. And I felt like in this show, you really did harbor so much of the responsibility to work through our synergy. But I appreciate your synergy. I appreciate your thoughts, and always a wonderful, insightful conversation with you. So I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm sure I'll be back not too far in the future.
Yeah, I always enjoy having you on. And for more on his stuff, again, go on his YouTube channel, subscribe there. But also, all the extra content he's been doing on the Patreon that he has also been pretty incredible. Again, for me, if you join me on Patreon, you help me continue to make these shows, and I have these shows without the ads. But he has additional content on his Patreon, so that is an extra bonus if you're already going on patreon.com to join him over there. And that also continues to help him make more shows. And I know that your shows take a little bit of long to think through, but again, as we know, when it comes to content creation, the more money you throw at us content creators, the more content we seem to be able to push out. So again, for the Purists and myself, everybody, I hope you enjoyed. I've been getting away from this season, just based on my schedule and things in life, but I always enjoy sitting down and having these all conversations well. So I hope you appreciate it, enjoyed it. Leave a comment on YouTube to let me know you enjoyed these conversations, that you want these long form guests back again. And again, help me out on Patreon or subscribe on the YouTube channel. That's the way that these kind of shows happen. So without further ado, we will see you, definitely either later this week or next week for another conversation like this. And as always, until next time, what's the part?